Hello, this is Evan for Grips.com. In today's lesson, I'm going to discuss a topic that I think all beginners should start at, and that is starting hand ranges. If you haven't yet, please watch the video entitled The Triple Threat so you can get a greater understanding of the game of poker and what things you want to be using to your advantage to maximize your chances of winning, and then come back and watch this video. I think that the second step after getting a good understanding of the game that you should look into is which hands you should start with, because obviously in Hold'em and in all poker games the first decision you have is whether or not you should play your hand, and in this guide I'm going to cover which hands I think you can play profitably, and covering both styles, a tight style and a loose style. So for those of you who want to mix it up, there is a looser hand range associated with that, and for those who want to play more conservative, we will cover tight hand ranges. So the first thing you need to understand to be a winning Hold'em player is positional awareness. And that is really just the fact that knowing position gives you a big advantage in a hand. Because when you have position, it's easier to gain information about your opponent's hand. They have to act before you on each street, thereby giving you information. And it's also easier to extract value when you have position because you will have the last bet on each street. You can also implement some tricks like the free card play, raising to get a free showdown. Lots of fun stuff that you can't do when you are out of position. As more hands are dealt, so when you go from playing heads up to playing three-handed to playing four-handed and to eventually playing 10-handed, starting hand requirements become stricter. That is due to the fact that with more players being dealt into a hand, you're less likely to simply pick up the blinds when you raise, and you're more likely to find yourself playing out of position rather than in position. An example of the starting hand strength being very important is that in a six-handed game, if you're dealt ace-queen, odds are you got dealt the best hand. If, however, you're playing in a 10-handed game, ace-queen is more likely to be the second best hand, and that's why in many cases people actually advise folding ace-queen in early position and only playing it in late position when you have fewer hands to get through. Similarly, in a six-handed setting, pocket nines is most likely going to be the best hand, but once you get to a 10-handed scenario, you're going to need something more like pocket jacks before you can assume that you got dealt the best starting hand of all the players at the table. The way that we adjust to having position and taking advantage of positional awareness is that as your position improves, you raise more hands. You raise a wider range of holdings. So, let's start with the first position, which is under the gun. In a six-handed game, this guide is going to be applicable to six-handed play. For 10-handed play, we will do another guide covering that. So when you're under the gun, at a short-handed table, you have 5 players to get through, 3 of whom will be in position, and 2 of whom will be out of position. That's the small blind and the big blind. Because there are 5 people to get through, there's a greater chance of multi-way action, which means we need hands that can flop good equity. You want hands that can flop not only top pair, but you also want hands that can flop a lot of draws, due to the fact that you might be playing a multi-way pot where pairs decrease in value and drawing hands go up in value. Also, given that there are 3 players to get through in position, you're likely to get played back at by someone who is in position, whether it be by them flatting your raise or by re-raising you, forcing you to play a pot out of position. What this means is you want to be very selective with which hands you open when you are raising from under the gun. So, the tight opening range for under the gun consists of the top 7% of hands. This is definitely on the tight side, and people will argue you can get looser, but you can't go wrong opening this range of hands under the gun. So pocket pairs, 7s and up, suited aces, ace-10 suited and up. For your suited connectors, it's pretty much just ace-king and king-queen suited. As I said, it's pretty tight. And for high card hands, it's ace-queen offsuit. That's also ace-king included. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm not going to go through what my hand rankings mean. You can understand from this first slide that the hands that I show are the minimum hand that you can have in that category to open. Any hand that's better than one of the ones listed here will naturally qualify for being raisable. So what if we want to play a more loose opening range when we're under the gun. That's fine. We're going to cover that. The times you want to implement this is on a weak table. So that either means that people are playing very tight and your races are therefore more likely to get through. You're going to find yourself playing out of position less frequently. Or it could mean that people play very poorly post-flop. Therefore, you want to try to get into as many post-flop situations as possible to capitalize on your post-flop advantage and your post-flop edge, your money-making potential. So the loose aggressive opening range is the top 14% of hands, which can be seen here. Now we're going to move on to the hijack, which is one seat over from under the gun. In this position you have only 4 players to get through now, 2 of whom are in position. That's the cutoff and the button, and 2 of whom are going to be out of position. Average hand strength goes down for opponents. As I talked about on the first slide, now instead of having to get through 5 hands, we only have to get through 4 hands. So it's less likely we're going to run into a big hand when we only have 4 opponents to get through. This means that we can start opening a few more hands than we could when we are under the gun. We have a greater likelihood of stealing the blinds, we have a greater likelihood of playing in position, and just a lower likelihood of getting played back at. So the tight opening range for, well, that should say hijack, but it doesn't, is the top 12% of hands. If we're going to be playing a looser range from the hijack, again, this should be implemented when the players in position are weak. When you're under the gun, you have to worry about the whole table. As you start to get in later position, you're more concerned about who is in position on you. If you have weak players in position and strong players in the blinds, you can open a wider range than you could if you have strong players in position who are likely to play back at you, and weak players in the blinds. Obviously, when we have more weak players in the blinds, we want to be raising more hands because we have a greater likelihood of playing an in-position pot versus those opponents. So the loose aggressive opening range from the hijack is the top 20% of hands, which I think is fairly loose, but if you think your table is one that you have very good control over, this is about as wide as you want to go. Next we have the cutoff, where now we only have to get through 3 players, only one of whom is in position, and this is going to be a big factor for why our range gets so much wider on the cutoff. What we're doing when we raise the cutoff is attempting to buy the button and therefore having position throughout the remainder of the hand. If you can get the button to fold, and you only have the blinds to get through, now you're guaranteed to have position throughout the rest of the hand, which means a major advantage as compared to when you are raising from early position and might find yourself playing out of position against some opponents. Also, now that there are only 3 players to get through, the pot is much more likely to be heads up rather than multi-way, which means hands that can make top pair become much stronger. As I said earlier in the presentation, the fewer opponents that are in the pot, the more powerful one pair hands become, and the less powerful drawing hands are. So you want to pay attention to who's on the button, because that really determines what the odds are of you getting position for the hand. If you have a guy who really likes to call a lot on the button and 3-bet a lot from the button and really take advantage of his position, you probably want to opt to open the tighter opening range. If, however, the button is someone who plays extremely tight and is going to be folding to your raise 90% of the time or greater, that's when you can maybe lean towards opening the looser range of the 2 that will be given now. This tight range for under the gun is the top 20% of hands, and it's different than the loose opening range for the hijack, because when we're likely to be in position and to be playing a heads-up pot, we're looking more so for hands that can make top pair rather than hands that can flop really strong draws. So we have more high card hands in this range and narrower range of gappers and suited connectors than we do with the cutoff loose opening range. That's because as the pot's more multi-way, the more powerful suitedness is and the ability to flop draws is. So from the cutoff, as I just said, If you want to go with the loose opening range, it's best implemented when the button is a tight or timid player. And the loose aggressive opening range is the top 30% of hands. And you see that now, on top of just suited aces and suited connectors and pairs, we've now also added suited high card hands. This is because that ability, again, to make top pair becomes more powerful. So a king 2 suited and a queen 5 suited are hands that we are now raising. Whereas before, if we were going to open suited hands, we wanted ones that can flop both straight and flush draws. Now, once you're in late position and very unlikely to be playing a multi-way pot, the ability to hit top pair becomes more important. The ability to have an overcard to opponents' ranges of pairs that they defend is very important because it means a lot more equity. Like a hand like king 2 suited has more equity against pocket nines than 7-6 suited due to the fact that it just has one overcard. Also, you're unlikely to flop a flush draw when your opponent flops a flush draw. So to be able to flop a high ranking flush draw is pretty sweet when opening from late position. Okay, next we have the button where we only have 2 players to get through and they are both out of position, which means we are guaranteed position for the duration of the hand, which means we can open a very wide range of holdings. The important thing to think about here when deciding how to construct your range for opening hands on the button is how your opponents are likely to play back at you. If your opponents are likely to be 3-betting you, you want to be focusing on opening hands that can either call 3-bets or 4-bet. If, however, your opponents are most likely just going to be calling your raises, you want hands that can flop some equity. Likewise, if your opponents are likely to defend post-flop by just checking and calling you down, the ability to make top pair is more valuable. Whereas if your opponents are going to play back at you with check raises, it's important to have hands that can flop equity and strong draws that can continue against these check raises and deal with those bloated pots. So the tight opening range for the button is the top 33% of hands, as seen here. And then we have the loose opening range, which should be used when your opponents in the blinds are either tight, so they're just going to be folding a lot to your raise. And mathematically, it makes sense to open a ton of hands if your opponents are just going to be folding 90% of the times to your open, or collie, meaning you're not very likely to get 3-bet, so you don't need to worry about your hand's playability versus a 3-betting range. And when I say suited connector, suited gappers, and suited high cards, what I'm pretty much saying is if your hand's suited and you have weak players in the blinds, you can go ahead and open that button. You're just going to be winning the pot so much pre-flop and so frequently post-flop with a simple c-bet that you can go pretty wide. You're very unlikely to get to showdown against these really tight opponents, so your cards really don't matter, and you're just really hammering away the fact that you have position, so you want to play a high frequency of hands and get involved in a lot of spots in position, taking down those small pots. Okay, finally we have the small blind where we have 1 player to get through, but we are guaranteed to be playing out of position for the hand. If your opponent doesn't defend much and he's just kind of a pushover who's playing really tight, you can open any 2 cards because I think your pre-flop raise has to be successful like 70% of the time if you're opening for 3 big blinds. And if your opponent's just folding like 80 or 90% of the times, you can see why that would immediately be profitable if you aren't giving away any money post-flop. Also, your range should depend on your opponent's play style. If they fold to a lot of c-bets, like a really high percentage of c-bets, 80 or 90%, you want to be opening an extremely wide range and just c-betting every flop and just seeing the immediate profits from that strategy. If your opponent stacks off really lightly post-flop, like if they flop top pair, they're never going to be able to fold it, you can open a lot of speculative hands and have some really high implied odds. If, however, your opponent's strong, they know how to float, they know how to bluff raise, they know how to put you to tough spots, that's when you want to narrow your opening range from the small blind, because suddenly that positional disadvantage is really going to play in to the operation and make it more difficult for you to just show an immediate profit by playing a fairly exploitable strategy. So tight opening range from the small blind is top 22% of hands. hands that can flop really strong draws, those being the suited aces and the direct suited connectors. And you can see our suited gap range isn't that wide because we really want to either be flopping top pair or mid pair, which having your second card be an 8 or better is pretty helpful for, or you want to be flopping really strong draws. Also, likewise with high card hands, we don't want to be flopping bottom pair or mid pair weak kicker against a tough opponent, so that's why the high card hands are still pretty restricted, just being ace 8, king 10, queen jack offsuit and better. And finally we have the small blind range that's pretty loose, which should be used when the big blind is either tight before the flop or they're really selective about what hands they'll continue with post flop. Like they don't like to call the flop very wide, and they just fold most of the time. So against those guys, you just want to be opening the pot and putting in that pressure in post flop, and just picking up that dead money for all the times that they don't connect hard enough with the board to continue. So the loose opening range, I didn't put it in here, but I think it's about 40% of hands. And you can see that we go a lot wider on the suited gappers because of the fact that A, we're rarely going to get to showdown, so our hand's not that important. But if we're playing against someone who's just going to play weakly and call down with a top pair type hand or something and let us see a lot of free cards, we want hands that can flop disguised draws and disguised strong hands that our opponent's not going to put us on, and therefore be more willing to stack off against. Okay, and that wraps up the video. If you want to, get those hand ranges down, just watch the video and hit print screen anytime the slides come up, and copy the ranges down to a notepad file or a WordPad file. And what I wanted to do with this video, rather than simply giving you a strict rubric for what hands to play, is show you that there can be a profitable range of hands to play, and it's not fixed. You can play a really tight range or a really loose range or anywhere in between, and as long as you're doing it for the right reasons, you should be able to show a profit. So before opening a hand, always consider what's most likely to happen based on the opponents I have behind me. Am I likely to get flat called by someone in position and be stuck playing a pot out of position? Am I likely to get 3-bet by someone who's in position and be dealing with a re-raise pot situation out of position? Also, who's in the blinds? Are there strong players in the blinds that I don't really want to play pots with? Or are there weak players in the blinds that I want to get involved with as often as possible when I have position and the lead in the hand? These are the type of factors you want to consider every time the action's on you, and you want to figure out whether you should raise your hand or not. Some hands will be extremely profitable in some situations and will be big losers in other situations, depending on who's behind you and how the hand is most likely to play out. And what it comes down to is you should decide, based on your style, your personality, your understanding and your approach to the game, what opening range works best for you. I gave you the borderlines. If you go tighter than my tight range, you're playing too tight, and if you go looser than my loose range, well, you're asking for a little bit of trouble. But anywhere between the two ranges is perfectly fine, and you will find one that suits your style best, makes you comfortable and confident every time you're going to the flop. I hope you found this video informative. Please leave me your comments, and good luck on the tables. This has been Evan for Grips.com. Now go out there and get stacking, guys. You got all the info you need. Put it to good use.